Last time we spoke about how Albert Speer was taking over the German economy. Soviet forces pressed offensives on the Volkhov front, expanding salients near Yuban against German strongpoints. The Northwestern Front encircled 95,000 Germans at Demyansk, relying on inadequate air supplies while sieges persisted at Kalm and Staraya Russa. In the center, Zhukov's Western Front faced Modul's counterattacks near Vyazma, with cavalry raids disrupting German logistics. Ukraine's saw von Bock's offensive stalled Timoshenko salient, and Crimea remained deadlocked, with Kozlov delaying attacks due to logistics. In Leningrad, malnutrition dominated deaths despite epidemic prevention, with the erode of life boosting rations and evacuations. German policies included military brothels to control VD and intelligence leaks. Centrally, Reich Minister Fritz Dott died in a suspicious plane crash on February 8th. His successor, Albert Speer, streamlined armament production, expanding committees, and boosted efficiency. This episode is the start of the Demyansk Airbridge. Hello again and welcome back to the Eastern Front Week by Week podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fallen Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, found over at YouTube, or my podcast series, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. Over there, we're doing two miniseries covering the Taiping Rebellion and the 7 Years' War. Also, if you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for subjects I will tackle next. Building directly upon the successes achieved by Roginsky's group in the previous week, on February the 19th, the Soviet Second Shock Army launched a determined assault northwards. Their forces managed to envelop and subsequently capture the strategically important location of Krasnaya Gorka, effectively driving a deep wedge between the German 291st and 254th Divisions. Seizing the momentum from this victory, General Klekov issued orders for the attacking rifle divisions to press forward and exploit their gains by advancing towards the town of Luban, which lay just a mere 10 kilometers away. To further disrupt German operations, the cavalry units and specialized ski troops were detached from the main force and tasked with severing the critical railroad line connecting Luban to Leningrad at the point of Ryabova. This bold maneuver posed a serious threat to isolate the German First Army Corps from the remainder of the 18th Army. Should this encirclement succeed and lead to the destruction of these isolated units, it could pave the way for reopening the vital supply routes to Leningrad, thereby lifting the brutal siege that had gripped the city for months. According to historical estimates provided by the military analyst David Glantz, the total number of deaths in Leningrad from February of 1941 through February of 1942 reached a staggering 460,000, with the overwhelming majority of these tragic losses attributable to the hardships and the deprivations imposed by the ongoing siege. Now, shifting our attention to the southern sectors, the German 16th Army found itself stretched to its absolute limits under relentless pressure from the Soviet Northwestern Front. This dire situation compelled General Ernst Busch to urgently request reinforcements, a plea that was eventually approved by Adolf Hitler himself. As a result, 3 full divisions were slated for transfer from Germany, with an additional one coming from the Leningrad area. In the meantime, the remaining elements of the 5th Light Division finalized their deployment to the beleaguered region. Being amongst the first reinforcements to arrive on the scene, this division received immediate orders to extend and fortify the defensive perimeter southwards along the banks of the Polotsk River. General Busch was resolute in his belief that maintaining control over this river line was absolutely essential if the 16th Army harbored any realistic hopes of mounting a relief operation for the trapped 2nd Corps in the Demyansk area. Despite these efforts, the German forces in Demyansk successfully repelled the offensives launched by the Soviet First Shock Army, which had been ambitiously tasked by Stalin with reaching the distant objectives of Pskov and Ostrov by the month's end. On February the 15th, the Soviet 2nd Guards Rifle Corps advanced sufficiently southwards to begin establishing connections with the 3rd Shock Army in the area northeast of Kulm. This linkage effectively created the outer ring of what became a major encirclement around the German 2nd Army Corps. Simultaneously, the 1st and 3rd Shock Armies were methodically advancing towards the location of Zelyuche. Historical Soviet sources present some discrepancies regarding the exact timing of their unification at this point, with varying accounts suggesting dates of February the 20th, 25th, or even the 26th. Regardless of the precise moment, their intention was clear, to converge and form a solid inner ring of encirclement. Although the elite SS Totenkopf troops managed to impede the Soviet progress and create delays, they ultimately proved unable to completely stop the advancing Soviet prongs that were steadily closing in around the 2nd Army Corps from multiple directions. The encircled 2nd Corps had become entirely dependent on the Luftwaffe for essential resupplies, but initial efforts in this regard had been nothing short of a complete and dismal failure. In response to this crisis, Lufttransportführer Fritz Motzit was urgently dispatched to the southern Pskov Air Base to assume command over the airlift operations. Operating with a remarkably small staff of just 9 men, and equipped with only a single telephone, Motzit swiftly organized the transfer of 5 additional transport groups to bolster the existing 2 already in place. Furthermore, specialized air traffic control parties were established within the Demyansk pocket to streamline operations. Comprehensive measures were implemented to mitigate the severe impacts of the extreme cold, with temperatures plummeting to -40 degrees Celsius, which drastically reduced aircraft serviceability rates to a mere 30% and made any outdoor engine maintenance utterly impossible. Other formidable challenges included the cracking of rubber tires under the frigid conditions, as well as the freezing solid of oil and gas lines due to the unrelenting low temperatures. To enhance stealth and avoid detection, Motzit issued orders for the transport aircraft to fly at treetop levels for most of the 90-minute journey. At this stage, however, the Soviet VVS was primarily concentrated on providing ground support for the 3rd Shock Army, leaving them unable to mount any significant interdiction efforts against the airlift. Each Tu-52 transport plane was capable of carrying only about 2 tons of supplies, meaning that it would require a fleet extending 200 of such aircraft to meet the minimum daily demands of the 2nd Corps. Even achieving this level would necessitate severe and strictly enforced rationing amongst the trapped soldiers. Consequently, the airlift managed to prevent the total collapse of the 2nd Army Corps, but at a steep cost. Food rations were cut to 2/3 of the normal levels, ammunition allocations were halved, and horses, vital for transport and logistics, received only 1/4 of the required daily nutritional needs. Compounding these issues was the reluctance of the 2nd Corps command to allocate sufficient personnel or equipment for distributing these supplies, leading to stockpiles accumulating at the airstrip, rather than being efficiently delivered to the frontline units, where they are most desperately needed. In addition to the responsibilities at Demyansk, Fritz Motzit was also tasked with ensuring the continued supply to the small German garrison holding out at Kulm. This pocket required fewer resources compared to the larger Demyansk encirclement, with a minimum daily need of just 15 tons of ammunition and food supplies. However, the challenges at Kulm were uniquely daunting. The diminutive airstrip measured only 540 yards in length. It was well within range of Soviet artillery, and it faced constant harassment from enemy fire. Already several aircraft had been struck and damaged while on the ground, heightening the risks. This perilous situation made Motzit hesitant to commit transport planes to landing there, though pressure from the OKL, that being the Luftwaffe High Command, in Berlin was mounting to reverse his cautious stance. As an interim solution, Go-242 gliders and 250-kilogram supply bombs were employed to airdrop essential materials, with these operations commencing from February the 16th onwards. Inside the Kulm pocket itself, fierce combat continued unabated as the German garrison worked tirelessly to contain the successful assault launched the previous week by the Soviet 82nd Rifle Regiment, which had been supported by Matilda II tanks. It took until February the 18th for the 386th Infantry Regiment to finally seal off the breach in their defensive lines. They received invaluable assistance from 2 forward observers attached to Group Uckermann, who had been able to direct devastating 21-centimeter artillery fire with an impressively short delay of only 10 minutes. Throughout this grueling period, the garrison endured over 550 casualties and depleted the vast majority of its ammunition reserves since the Soviet assault had begun on February the 13th. Faced with their inability to penetrate the German defenses at Qom, Soviet commander Makarev resorted to ordering a massive artillery barrage targeting every building within the pocket. His strategy was to demolish the roofs of the structures, exposing the defenders to the lethal winter cold and potentially freezing them to death. In response, both soldiers and any remaining civilians sought refuge in cellars to endure the harsh conditions. By this point, more than 100 wounded individuals were being cared for by just 2 doctors, who were operating with severely limited medical supplies. Despite the heavy toll on Soviet forces, which led to some defections to the German side, mind you, these defectors were promptly put to work on manual labor tasks to enhance the fortification of the defenses. On the morning of February the 21st, General Perkov issued orders for a major offensive push. The 2nd Guards Rifle Corps had been reassigned under the command of the 3rd Shock Army. It was now directed to assault Qom as it approached from the north. To initiate this renewed offensive, the 130th Rifle Division, supported by 2 additional brigades, launched an attack against Group Uckermann's artillery strongpoint at Dubrova. Remarkably, this position managed to hold firm throughout the remainder of the day, showcasing the tenacity of the German defenses. During the same week, Adolf Hitler made a notable announcement to his army group commanders, declaring that, quote, "Danger of a panic in the 1812 sense," obviously referring to the historical retreat of Napoleon's forces from Russia, had been successfully eliminated. Across the vast expanse of the front lines, Soviet forces appeared to have exhausted much of their offensive momentum, with the notable exception of those units still fiercely engaging the German 16th Army. Nevertheless, Hitler expressed strong confidence in the feasibility of launching a new offensive aimed at eradicating the entire Toropet salient, which posed a significant threat to the German positions. Meanwhile, on February the 16th, amidst mounting concerns over potential failures in operations, the Stavka issued a stern demand to General Zhukov. They insisted that he, quote, "mobilize all the strength of the Kalinin and Western fronts for the final destruction of Army Group Center." Following this destruction, the western direction was expected to advance all the way to the Dnieper River, achieving this monumental task by no later than March the 5th. Specifically, the orders called for smashing and annihilating the enemy's Lijev, Vyazma, Yokov grouping, and by March the 5th to reach the fortified positions along the old defensive line, complete with prepared anti-tank ditches. This directive was extraordinarily unrealistic, strongly indicating that the Stavka remained disconnected from the harsh realities faced by the troops at the front lines. It reflected their persistent overestimation of Soviet capabilities and a corresponding underestimation of the German Osters resilience, a miscalculation that was ironically mirrored by the Nazi leadership's own strategic errors. In response to these orders, Zhukov directed the 22nd, 30th, and 39th Armies to concentrate their efforts on capturing the Alina area. Concurrently, the 43rd, 49th, and 50th Armies were assigned the objectives of seizing Yukhnov. The 16th and 61st Armies were tasked with taking Dyansk. Following these initial captures, the plans called for the subsequent encirclement and the conquest of Vyazma and Lijev, which would effectively trap and destroy Army Group Center. These ambitious plans persisted despite the enormous losses already sustained by the Soviet forces. When the Soviet counteroffensive had commenced in December, the Western Front boasted an accumulation of over 600 tanks. Now, after months of relentless combat and continuous reinforcements, only 153 tanks remain operational, a stark testament to the attrition rates. Historian Vatodun had estimated that during this phase of the war, Soviet tanks typically survived about 14 hours of active combat before being destroyed or rendered inoperable. This dire situation was exacerbated by the steadily declining quality of the replacement manpower and equipment since the offensive's inception in December. To meet the demands of the front lines, training periods were being shortened and production processes were being increasingly rushed, leading to compromises in effectiveness and reliability. All attempts by the Soviet 29th Army to break out of its encircled pocket near Lijev had ended in failure. as had every effort to relieve it from the external forces. At various points over the preceding weeks, the desperate offensives launched by the 30th Army had managed to penetrate to within 4 kilometers of the trapped 29th Army when attacking from the north, only to be repelled each time. Consequently, this week the Kalinin Front leadership acknowledged that the German 9th Army possessed sufficient strength to prevent any successful link-up with the northern direction. This realization prompted a strategic pivot, redirecting primary efforts towards the 22nd Army's attempts to breach the German lines at Bieli. However, attacks in the north were to continue in order to keep the German forces pinned down and divided. On February the 19th, General Konev issued orders for the reinforced 22nd Army to capture Bieli by the 22nd and then proceed to Alinina by the 23rd. The 30th Army was instructed to reach Chetolino by the 22nd and link up with the 39th Army the following day. Meanwhile, the 31st Army was to seize Substov by the 23rd. Notably, only the 31st Army commenced its attack on the designated start date, as persistent supply shortages delayed the operations of the other armies. Furthermore, the encircled 29th Army was now directed to attempt a breakthrough towards the 39th Army. To bolster their chances, they received reinforcements in the form of a single paratrooper battalion on February the 17th. At the outset of their last major breakout attempt, approximately 6,000 troops from the 29th Army's 9 divisions remained combat effective. Some historical sources indicate that around 5,200 of these soldiers were successfully infiltrated back to the Soviet lines by February the 28th. Tragically, on February the 20th, the 29th Army finally succumbed and collapsed, despite its valiant efforts. German reports claimed the capture of 26,000 men and 180 tanks, though another source would suggest that it was only 14,000 personnel who were lost from the 29th Army between January the 6th and February the 28th. This discrepancy might include captives from other Soviet armies involved in relief attempts, or it could simply reflect the common inconsistencies and exaggerations that characterize the Eastern Front. With the elimination of this pocket, the German defenders previously committed there became available to reinforce the lines isolating the Soviet 39th Army from the rest of the Kalinin Front, where cleanup operations were still required. Due to these ongoing Soviet offensives, Hitler reluctantly agreed to postpone any decisions regarding the proposed Brückenschlag operation, but insisted that the 9th Army prioritize preparations for it above all else. The Soviet 39th Army did not begin its northward attack until February the 25th. While the bulk of the German 9th Army remained heavily engaged, the 6th Panzer Division initiated what can be described as a snail offensive, aimed at pushing the Soviet 39th Army away from the vital Vyazma-Syshavka railway line. This operation involved occupying villages opportunistically, targeting those that presented the least resistance along the division's extensive 40-kilometer front line. Through this approach, they discovered they could advance approximately a kilometer per day with minimal expenditure of resources or effort. In preparation for the planned assault on Yoknov, another ambitious airborne operation was authorized. The plan involved dropping the remaining elements of the Soviet 4th Airborne Corps west of Yoknov along the Ugra River, with the objective of striking German defenses from the rear. Zhukov's detailed orders specified to conduct an air assault with the 9th and 214th Airborne Brigades and the 4th Battalion, 8th Airborne Brigade, with a corps of subunits into Velekopol, Shushmin, Zelany region. After landing, strike a blow from the rear against the enemy defenses in a general direction of Klitschy, subsequently occupying the line of Krokino, Borodino, Podsesonke, and reaching the line of Bezochenya, Klitschya, Tunovka, and Lianovo, where you will unite with the 50th Army units for the subsequent combined operations against the enemy Yukhnov Group. This airborne assault was intended to coincide with a frontal attack by the 50th Army. Opposing them were the 19th Panzer Division, the 137th Infantry Division, a regiment from the 52nd Infantry Division, and elements of the 10th Motorized Division along a 20-kilometer stretch of road southeast of the Rusa River. The remainder of the 10th Motorized Division guarded the road to Spaz-Demyansk. However, the designated drop zone was occupied by various German security, support, and rear area troops who would be alerted to any Soviet airdrops, having already established all-round defenses in the villages they held. Artillery fire was coordinated for mutual support amongst these positions. The most significant threats came from the 5th Panzer Division, parts of the 11th Panzer Division, and the 23rd Infantry Division, who were responsible for countering Soviet troops already operating behind German lines. Already scheduled to begin on February the 16th, the drop was postponed due to the late arrival of transport planes, ultimately commencing on the 18th. Critically, no fighter escort was provided for the transports, and none of the 3 planned Pathfinder teams were deployed in advance. Instead, reliance was placed on bonfires lit by partisans to guide the aircraft, a plan that inexplicably overlooked the prevalence of similar fires lit by soldiers for warmth and visibility amidst the winter fog. Predictably, German aircraft intervened, causing significant disruption, compounded by adverse weather conditions that forced the transports to fly at twice the intended altitude. This resulted in massive dispersion of the parachuters across a wide area. Many transports returned to base without even dropping their loads, unable to locate the drop zones. Rather than completing the operation in the planned 3 nights, drops extended until February the 24th, requiring a total of 612 sorties. An estimated 30% of the 7,373 men deployed never reunited with their units. Many formations could not assemble about 50% of their intended strength. Approximately 1,800 paratroopers ended up in the operational areas of the 33rd Army, or Beloff's forces, and integrated into these commands. Others joined local partisan groups. On February the 20th alone, 110 parachutists landed within the 33rd Army sector. German intelligence mistakenly believed only 3,000 men had been dropped and largely underestimated their potential threat. Astonishingly, the entire staff of the Airborne Corps was transported on a single plane, which was shot down by a German night fighter on February the 22nd. Most personnel perished. About only 24 survived. Many suffered from severe burns. With Commander Levashov killed, command was transferred to Kazenkin, who was among the few parachuters who was left relatively unscathed. However, the operation could have fared even worse. The Luftwaffe's ability to interfere was limited by exhaustion from their intensive operations elsewhere, allowing only a few planes to engage. Additionally, poor weather and shortages of ammunition reduced the effectiveness of German anti-aircraft fire on the ground. The German Fourth Army was so overstretched that it could do little more than maintain defensive positions in its warmed village outposts, awaiting the paratroopers' next moves. Their primary advantage lay in the several days required for the Soviet airborne troops to regroup, which provided ample time for German garrisons to reinforce their defenses and brace for the impending attacks. Simultaneously, the Soviet 43rd Army continued to launch daily attacks against the German Fourth Army in efforts to re-establish contact with the 33rd Army. The 33rd Army, however, adopted a more defensive posture due to critically low supplies and the need to repel German counterattacks. Likewise, the 49th and 50th Armies maintained pressure on the 4th Army's lines through siege-like operations. Unfortunately, these assaults lacked coordination and sufficient strength, largely because replacements were not reaching the Western Front in adequate numbers. Recognizing the vulnerabilities of the 57th Panzer Corps in protecting key roadways, on February the 16th, General Heinrici ordered his former 43rd Army Corps to defend the supply route between the Losa River and Fomino. Their previous positions at Yokov were to be assumed by the 12th and 13th Corps. Heinrici escalated this strategy on February 18th by requesting permission to abandon Yokov entirely in favor of establishing a shorter, more defensible line along the Ukra River. This adjustment would liberate additional units to safeguard the exposed flanks of the 4th Army. However, no one in the chain of command was willing to escalate this proposal to Hitler, as it would eliminate opportunities for a major encirclement of the Sukhanichi Bulge, though the 4th Army's Chief of Staff argued that closure was more feasible further west. Additionally, Kluge's Chief of Staff noted that Yokov appeared as a prominent thoroughfare on maps at Hitler's headquarters, inflating its perceived strategic value. Several days later, the OKH granted tentative approval to prepare the Uber line as a fallback position, but the issue was not presented to Hitler during this week. Notably, Hitler had previously demanded that the town remain within artillery range even after the Panzer Corps withdrew from it. Behind the German front lines, combat persisted with inconclusive results on February the 14th, but the situation intensified dramatically on the 15th. At Semnevo, the local German garrison executed a counterattack that successfully divided the Soviet cavalry and airborne troops. Reinforcements consisting of 2 infantry battalions and 8 panzers then arrived, encircling an entire airborne brigade, with all of his available forces committed elsewhere, except for the weakened 57th Cavalry Division, which lacked the strength to intervene effectively. General Belov was compelled to abandon the offensive on the 16th. Casualties were severe, reducing the 1st Guard Cavalry Division to just 60 combat-effective personnel. Moreover, numerous light artillery pieces were left behind in the deep snow, further diminishing their capabilities. After the ensuing days, the Airborne Brigade managed to exfiltrate the encirclement by navigating through nearby forests and regrouping at Alferovo. In a reorganization effort, Belov ordered 200 former parachutists from his cavalry units to join the Airborne Brigade, while compensating for cavalry losses by recruiting from local partisan groups. The brigade also incorporated some of the scattered paratroopers from the recent 4th Airborne Corps operation. As Belov worked to recover his forces, German troops attempted to dislodge them from their village strongpoints, but these efforts were successfully repelled. On February the 17th, Belov renewed his attempts to cross the Smolensk road. After another recruitment drive from partisans, his command numbered roughly 3,000 to 4,000 men, equipped with minimal heavy weapons, a significant decline from the original 7,000 cavalry that had crossed the Warsaw Highway. The 11th Guards Cavalry Regiment, comprising just over 100 men, was dispatched to support partisans in pinning down German troops at Drogobush, and if possible, capturing its railway station. Partisans had briefly seized Drogobush on the night of February the 15th before facing a counterattack. The main thrust bypassed German defenses, and by the 20th, Belov's forces were within 6 kilometers of Smolensk road, though the advance soon stalled. A renewed push on the 21st finally secured the railroad at Rebrovo, although the adjacent villages remained under German control. To the north, the Soviet 11th Cavalry Corps persisted in conducting raids on supply roads, but grappled with acute shortages of ammunition and a mounting toll of wounded personnel. By February the 4th, there was already 2,700 wounded and 150 cases of typhus infection. These problems only worsened throughout February, exacerbated by Zhukov's orders that all forces operating behind enemy lines must sustain themselves by living off the land, due to insufficient transport aircraft. Search for food locally. We will not be supplying it, because we don't have the airplanes. Search for shells also in place. On the 16th, Field Marshal von Kluge, growing increasingly frustrated with the stagnation afflicting the 2nd Panzer Army, demanded immediate offensive action. Rather than pursuing the 2 more ambitious options previously considered, Kluge opted for a comparatively straightforward objective, capturing Kirov, and closing the gap between the Panzer Army and the 4th Army. This breach was allowing excessive supplies to flow to partisans and the Red Army units disrupting operations in the rear of the 4th Army. Insufficient reinforcements precluded a drive to Rukhnov. However, this decision did not eliminate the potential for ordering one of the other offensives, which risked further diluting the Panzer Army strength. There was also apprehension amongst the staff that the Soviets might launch a major assault on Bryansk, prompting the retention of reserves. Across the entire army, only 45 tanks remained operational, and the 24th Panzer Corps was immobilized by Hitler's orders to hold the salient towards Sukhanitsy. As a result, the army lacked the concentrated force necessary for a decisive push to Kirov, leading to an operation that advanced at an excruciatingly slow pace throughout the month. Even as winter battles raged, planning for the German summer offensive was progressing, though in a notably minimalist fashion compared to the elaborate preparations for Operation Barbarossa. On the 15th, the OKH issued guidelines on managing the challenges of the Rasputitsa, with only vague references to contemplating summer operations later in the spring. At the suggestion of General Franz Halder, Field Marshal Fedor von Bock submitted a memorandum on the 19th. In it, he envisioned a multi-phased offensive. The first phase would secure the Don River line between Voronezh and Novaya Kalitva, establishing a stable northern flank. The second phase involved a 2-pronged advance to capture the lower Don River. The third phase aimed to seize the Don Bend and reach the Volga River west of Stalingrad. Only after accomplishing these would an operation to conquer the Caucasus become viable. Bug argued that attempting to reach Stalingrad in a single sweeping maneuver, which would require maintaining a 560-kilometer front line, was infeasible due to insufficient strength. He estimated needing about 85 divisions for this plan, 39 more than currently even available. Buck expressed skepticism about sourcing these additional divisions, as well as the logistical challenges of assembling and supplying them given the dilapidated state of the railways. Thus, he framed his memorandum as a theoretical inquiry into the operational possibilities. On March 3rd, Halder informed Bach that the document had reached Hitler, but the Führer had not yet read it due to his limited time for reviewing such extensive operational plans. In a similar vein, the Foreign Army's East Intelligence Section issued a report in mid-February warning that any offensives in the southern parts of the USSR would hardly surprise the Soviets. They cited evidence including statements by Marshal Semyon Timoshenko as early as December, suggesting the Germans would be forced to attack southwards for their oil resources, corroborated by repeated reports in British newspapers. Throughout February, Bach had also highlighted in his reports that the Oster was ill-prepared for a war of movement due to acute shortages of motor vehicles, prime movers, and horses. In response, the Wehrmacht prioritized the development of tracked vehicles like the Martier or the Raupenschlepper Ost. However, these initiatives would require time to mature, and production volumes would fall short of demand. Persistent economic inefficiencies such as resource hoarding by large industries and a reluctance to standardize on fewer models compounded the issues. Prior to Operation Barbarossa, the Wehrmacht utilized 151 different truck models. By spring of 1942, this was reduced to a still excessive 23 models. And for those of you who are curious about what I meant when I said there was large industrial issues and reluctance to standardize these models, if you go over to my podcast series, Echoes of War, I have a 12-part series covering the North Africa campaign of World War II, where me and my co-host spent a considerable amount of time going over the logistical issues plaguing the German army, and we really had a lot of fun time talking about how crazy it was for the German factories who were basically sabotaging each other while trying to pump out all these different vehicles. Honestly, it kind of plays out as a comedy. I do highly recommend it. Regardless, German doctrine emphasized mobility, yet the realities of war forced progressive demotorization of most of its forces. It's worth noting that Germany had to allocate substantial portions of its war economy to the resource-intensive air and naval campaigns against the Western Allies as well. Concurrently, the Soviets sought to enhance their economic efficiency to offset the devastating impacts of the German invasion and the massive evacuation of approximately 2,500 enterprises to the regions beyond the Urals. By the summer of 1942, only 54 of the previous year's 94 iron and steel works were operating at near capacity, according to historian Robert Citino. This was critical, as the USSR's 1942 steel output was only about 28% of Germany's, coal production 23%, and overall GDP about 70%. Crude oil production had dropped by a third, largely due to disrupted railway and road networks. Despite these setbacks, the USSR dramatically outproduced Germany in 1942, however. For instance, manufacturing 24,000 tanks compared to Germany's 6,000. However, much of this output in 1941 and 1942 was dedicated to replacing colossal material losses. 41,000 of 57,000 artillery pieces produced in 1941 replaced the losses, as did 20,000 of the 23,000 tanks. Achieving this required neglecting the civilian economy, of course. The Soviet emphasis was on producing inexpensive, reliable, and battle-proven systems. As recalled by the industrial commissar, Vyacheslav Malyshev, from a January 1942 conversation, Comrade Stalin repeatedly stressed the need for weapons that had performed well in combat, to be mass-produced without modifications. A prime example was the ramped-up production of cheap rockets and mortars to supplement traditional artillery, enabling denser concentrations from a peak of 12 guns or motors per kilometer in 1941 to about 45 to 65 per kilometer by summer of 1942. Tank production relied heavily on light models to bolster numbers. By May 1st of 1942, the Red Army fielded about 4,020 tanks, but over half, 2,025, were light tanks. Women were increasingly drafted into factories to replace workers conscripted into the army, reducing the workforce from 8.3 million in 1940 to about 5.5 million in 1942. Agriculture output plummeted due to the conscription of male laborers and the loss of fertile Ukrainian lands, leading some historians to speculate that without the Lend-Lease food aid, the USSR might have faced starvation. Lend-Lease comprised about 30% of the machinery and raw materials by value, 20% of agricultural products, contributing roughly 10% to the Soviet GDP in 1943 to 1944. Germany's pre-war population stood about 80 million, while its Eastern Front allies were smaller. Romania had about 16 million, Hungary 9 million, Finland 4 million, and Italy about 43 million, primarily engaged in the Mediterranean, but contributing an expeditionary corps in the east. To address military and manpower shortages, Germany relied on these allies, but their combined populations paled against the USSR's pre-war 171 million. Between 1941 and 1942, about 65 million Soviets fell under German occupation, narrowing the demographic gap. Many of the occupied were Ukrainians, Belarusians, or Balts, with questionable loyalty to the USSR. However, oppressive Nazi policies squandered this potential manpower source, turning it into a drain requiring occupational forces, except for some Baltic groups deemed Germanic. In the Crimea theater, reinforcements arrived to strengthen Luftwaffe interdiction efforts against supplies bound for Sevastopol. A group of 34 He-111 H-6 bombers under Major Horst Bieling command deployed to the Saki airfield. Trained as torpedo bombers, many aircraft were modified to carry 2 aerial torpedoes. However, they would not become operational until early March. I'd like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. But after all that, you're still hungry for some more history? Why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, found over at YouTube, or my podcast series, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. If you're looking to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/the Pacific War channel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. Soviet forces encircled 95,000 Germans at Demyansk, prompting a desperate Luftwaffe airlift under Fritz Morzik amidst the negative 40 °C conditions and supply shortages. Smaller resupplies sustained the calm pocket despite heavy artillery. The Soviet offensives aimed at Yuban and Yokov faltered due to logistics and German counterattacks. Airborne drops and cavalry raids disrupted lines, but attrition still mounted.